Okay, hi everyone. So thanks a million. I'm going to start by saying thanks a million to Anya and Brian and to everybody that set this up. It's one thing to think it's a great idea and lots of people that are interested in invertebrates of the Burren should come together. It's an entirely different thing to actually go and make it happen. So big kudos to you guys, and I think everybody is really thankful, and to all the other people that have worked behind the scenes to that. So really well done. Also, I should say I'm currently working as the grassland ecologist, so I'm feeling like perhaps a little bit of a fraud standing up here talking to you about land snails and land management. But as I'll explain, I've done a certain amount of work on land snails, and my PhD was based here in the Burren, looking at the effects of land management on land snails and plant communities. So that's the plan to talk to you today about. So I'll start off a little bit about my journey with molluscs and give you a little, very short overview of molluscs in Ireland, and then talk to you a good bit about that particular PhD project. That's kind of the focus of the talk. What I haven't done, in contrast to some of the talks yesterday, is kind of talk about the Burren more widely and what's special about the Burren. So it is going to be focused particularly on the management aspects in that particular project. I've got a couple of notes extra written down that I might say at the end that are a little bit, about some of the rarities and some of the annex species in the Burren. So I'll touch on that, but it is very much about that particular project. And this is the extent to which the annex vertigo species feature. So I'll mention them in a second. So as part of my journey into snails, before I started my PhD, I was working as an ecological consultant for a good number of years and on contract to NPWS. But I had my eyes and ears open potentially for a PhD project, and one came up looking at snail communities, plant communities, management. I liked the holistic side of it, so I jumped at it, but I was very much in at the deep end. So I won't lie, there were a few bottles of the holy snail wine drank to help me cope with the newfound skills and patience and all the things that are involved with learning something new. I was very lucky during my PhD. I got the opportunity to work kind of in a support and learning role with Evelyn Workins and Ian Killeen. So a lot of you in the room will know these guys. They've been the stalwarts of all sorts of different molluscan recording in Ireland and in Britain as well, quite a large role. So I worked with them on what was the National Monitoring Programme for Vertigo at that point. Shortly after finishing, I worked on a project, this is to Brian actually, in NPWS, looking at 4 species of rare mollusk, and Roy was involved in that, who's in the room. We sent Roy, lucky Roy, Oxalomus sarcei samples, putative and otherwise, for Roy to dissect and confirm or otherwise. So thanks, Roy, for fantastic specialist input to that. Some of the interesting side stuff, I've worked on a couple of archaeological projects. In Britain, snails are used a lot in calcareous habitats in terms of archaeology, in terms of telling you something about past land, vegetation types and even land management. Much less so here. They're very important where pollen isn't preserved. So in acidic wet habitats, you've got better pollen preservation. You get those through cores. So snails really come into their own in calcareous habitats. Much less of a scene here. Possibly related to fewer malacologists, but a number of reasons. So I did look at some of the archaeological samples from Paulnabrone Portal Tomb, and that's since been, it's part of a bigger body of work telling the story of that monument, which a lot of you will be familiar with. Then I was the lead malacologist, again with support and input from Roy on this. I was working with Beck Consultants on the 4-year national survey for the 3 vertigo species that are listed on the Habitats Directive. So spent a lot of time in a lot of nice sites and some hard work sites, and a lot of time scratching my head, is it me or the snails just not here? But had a lot of fantastic finds as well, and a lot of learning as part of that. And also, along with Dave, who's in the room, Roy and Anna, did some vertigo sampling in Northern Ireland as well, and that, Damien, of course, was involved in that. So look, a good burst of work. A lot of the work was kind of focused on vertigo, but as I said, I'm going to come back and talk more about our general background molluscan communities in the habitats in the Burren. Just so you know, on the extreme left, and the pictures are repeated a few times, on the extreme left is Vertigo gyri, next to that is Vertigo angustior, and next to that is Vertigo mullinsiana. And if anybody is curious, some of you will know these well, but I've got some snails and a hand lens to pass around, so this can be passed around as I'm speaking. Inside in this tube, there's a smaller tube, and inside in that, there's 7 adult vertigos from 4 different species. So if you haven't seen vertigo, people often say, I think I've seen them, and I'd say you haven't. They're so tiny, unless you were out with, a handful of people. So I'm going to pass those around, and people can be having a look as they go. The chances of us finding them in the field are slim enough. You'll understand why, but we'll see maybe later on. So yeah, just a little overview. I like to know the overview. Am I looking at 1,000 species or 100 species? So it's about 150 species of native non-marine mollusk. I realise now Roy is probably thinking that number's out of date. We've done work on the slugs with DNA. So that is probably a little out of date, but roughly. So you have a ballpark. And around 27 introduced species. These are the non-marine mollusks. Not talking about slugs at all today. The focus is very much on land snails, so the terrestrial gastropods. No slugs, no freshwater mollusks in this. And I think it was already mentioned, about 2/3 of the snail species recorded in the Burren. Again, just roughly, so we have an idea. And that photo is from Roy. From a great website, by the way, Mollusk Ireland. If you Google Mollusk Ireland, all one word, great website that you can dip in, see photographs, and get some nice general information on snails. Another great resource is we have a red list for non-marine mollusks. So that's downloadable from the MPWS website. Just Google it. Great resource. So to give you an idea, when the list was put together, we had 2 species that were considered extinct in Ireland. One has since been refound, Omphiscula glabra. Precarious enough, small population, small site, undesignated if I remember correctly, but it's still hanging on in there. So now that has been moved to the critically endangered list. So we have 6 critically endangered species, including a Burren speciality, Pomatius elegans, the round-mouthed snail. You can see where it got its name. So this is only known in Ireland from a patch of limestone pavement, kind of near Lough Marie, near the Finnevara, the flaggy shore. Actually, I have a map. So you can see Lough Marie, the red arrows pointing at Lough Marie. So there's an area of pavement around there. It's found there, a couple of hectares in size, and it's not known elsewhere in Ireland. So a bit of an enigmatic species. And there's a paper mentioned there by, I can't remember her first name now, but Platts and Elizabeth Platts, yeah. So you can get detail on, went and did a study there if you're interested in any more. 14 species from our national fauna are considered endangered, including Vertigo pusilla, which is the wall whorl snail. So I found 1 shell in my PhD study work, long dead, 1 shell in the Paul Nabrone work, obviously long dead. So certainly was present here, may or may not be. I don't know whether you have any update, Roy. Has it been seen?
Sorry, the only recent records have been from the Gilligan Strand, believe me.
Okay.
On the north coast.
Yeah.
In the sand dunes.
Yeah, so exceptionally rare, but maybe in the Burren. There literally are not many people looking at the snails and sampling things this tiny. So definitely eyes peeled for tiny sinistral. So this is I won't be getting too much into snail ID, but this one is coiled in the opposite direction. So it has the mouth opening on the left-hand side, which is a less common setup. So it's a good flag. If you're looking at a tiny snail and its mouth is on that side, you're immediately down to just a couple of species. 26 species assessed as vulnerable. 10 species from across our full suite are considered as having populations of international worth here in Ireland in terms of our molluscan fauna. Some species are essentially nearly endemic to Britain and Ireland. Ashfordia granulata, I mentioned there, it's really common in Dublin, in urban Dublin. I have just moved from a small terraced house in Ballyfermot, and there's Ashfordia granulata front and back, and the front is cobbled. But it is not known, it's barely known from outside these islands. So we do have important fauna. Leostyla anglica, again, is not uncommon across the Burren, certainly. 6 of our molluscan species are protected on the Habitats Directive, so more than our arthropods. In terms of what has led to all these species being red listed, it's the same old story, and you can look at a lot of the detail, but it comes down to habitat loss and habitat change. And a species we should certainly see today is the heath snail, quite a big, obvious snail in the Burren. It doesn't mind warm weather. Most snails are hiding from this weather. They're exceptionally hard to find when it's this hot and dry. This is a xeric species, so it doesn't mind the hot weather. And again, it's one of our largest snails and one of our most, well, the colour pattern varies, but it's quite characteristic with the stripes. Massive decrease you can see there in the graphs. And again, that's land management. So this would have been found in semi-natural grasslands all across the country, and it's been squeezed out. So it's those dots that are remaining in the Midlands are probably on small eskers or small patches of semi-natural grassland remaining, and then a lot of coastal sites. You find it still on the dunes. But that and a similar picture is replicated across quite a few species. So some of the surprises, when I started learning snails, I came as a complete newbie. I thought this would be something interesting to get into, and it certainly was. So I didn't know we had hairy snails. There are snails that have hairs on the outside of their shell. One of the most common species here in the Burren is one of the hairy snails, so we might get to see them. Well worth having a look. It's just, I find it an oddity. Spiky snails. So this is Icantinula aculeata. So the periostracum, the outside layer on the shell, is kind of stretched out into these sort of pliable spikes. Quite an interesting looking species. So you find that in scrub and woodland habitat in the leaf litter. And we have a snail that emits a very strong smell of garlic when it's disturbed, when it's alive, obviously. So again, that's quite an interesting kind of, maybe that gave the inspiration to the countries that like eating snails more than we do in this culture. Also came as a surprise to me, the size of them. Nobody told me they were all so tiny. So we have a common garden snail here, which is out of focus because I couldn't get the two in focus in the same shot. And just an example of, there's two species of crystal snails laid out there on that's a post-it, a black post-it at the bottom. So you can fit many, many hundreds of most of our species inside one shell of some of our largest species. And most of us only ever see the large species because they're often the ones that are in our gardens or simply are visible with ease. And again, I wasn't prepared for the nuances. So the top row, all of the top row are Agopinella pura. All of the bottom row are Agopinella nitidula. So as adults on the left, clearly you've got the size as a main cue to telling them apart. As juveniles, you're looking for very subtle differences. So yeah, I wasn't prepared for the descriptions of roundiness and curvedness and spiral, and yeah. So it takes quite a bit of practice. It's a slow art and quite a bit of practice to get your head around. And you need to do this. You need to lay things out, and you need to have verified specimens to compare things against when you're learning, because you're not counting. It's not, are there four hairs or five? It's, is it rounder? You can only tell that when you have got things to compare it to. So the study in the Burren. So my PhD involved looking at what would be the effect of cessation of grazing on biodiversity. So essentially changing in land management or stopping farming. So cessation of grazing. The main grazers involved are cattle, at these study sites at least, and sometimes feral goats, because yeah, we don't get to control what they do to a great extent or where they go. And the study involved using fenced exclosures to exclude these grazers, and we were tracking the changes in the plant communities and the snail communities over time. So that's an example of one of the exclosures at a grassland site, and a grazer looking forlornly in at the taller, juicier vegetation on the inside. So 3 habitat types made up the study. So we looked at woodland habitats, like in that image there, so hazel woodland. We looked at scrub habitats, so both hazel as the dominant woody species, but one with a closed canopy and a distinct woodland flora underneath, the other with patchy hazel. So it's very hard to move through. It's, kind of head height rather than above your head. It's a good measure. Can I easily move through this or not? Am I moving under hazel or through hazel? Very heterogeneous, and as I'll come back to, hugely important and very distinct in terms of the communities that it supports. And the grasslands, as I mentioned. So 3 habitat types under study. And quite widely spread, the study sites across the North Burren in counties Clare and Galway. So yeah, no need to worry too much about the detail, but quite a nice spread across the Burren for the sites. So at each site, there was a fenced plot erected, 20 by 20 metres. You can see that on the right-hand side with the red line. And inside, I had quadrats. So 5 2 by 2 metre quadrats for the plants. And then the snail quadrats were done just beside those. So I had kind of a similar pattern for those. Nearby to every fenced plot, there was an unmarked control plot. So I had underground metal markers. So I often look like a treasure hunter, but a really frustrated one with a metal detector trying to re-find my metal markers. So it's a good tool, but it's a lot of work. 288 quadrats sampled over the 3 years for the mollusks. We did a subsample the middle year, just for the biggest change was clearly going to be between the first and the final year of the PhD work. And as I mentioned, 3 habitats, 4 replicates at each habitat. So those 12 sites in total in the study. So for the snails, this is again a grassland example. We'll clear the vegetation down to the soil layer and take any loose soil and litter. A very elaborate, laborious drying process, so I have cloth bags. If the weather's good, that can be outside. Mostly it was inside. So most of the snail sampling took place in October, November, so invariably the weather wasn't good enough for drying, or I was busy out at the next study site and I couldn't be watching them. It's like trying to put out your washing yourself. So there's blow heaters, there's a twirly close out, and so they would start off in those bags, and then I would dry them further in kind of these low open fruit boxes with newspapers, and I would change the newspapers. It's very laborious when you're doing this very systematic sampling. And this isn't me, but yeah, the end thing is you have a small sample that you've sieved down and you're sorting through for the snails. And again, an awful lot of them are tiny, so you are doing an awful lot of this with the help of magnifiers. So I have a headband magnifier that I look completely crazy in, like a jeweler might have, but cheaper and more crazy looking. And then the microscope work as well. So overall, about 3,500 individual snail specimens. of which only about a quarter were adult. And it's already, like I've shown, it's already quite a bit of work with a lot of these species, getting them to species level, certainly when you're learning, when you've got nice, fresh adults. So only about a quarter of those specimens were adults. About half were immature, and so tinier and didn't have all their features developed. And about a quarter were dead. And so they'll be more faded. They might be lacking some of their shell architecture or some of their color or whatever. But that was kind of the makeup across the specimens. Most of the specimens were tiny, so less than a millimetre. It doesn't mean that all of our species are less than a millimetre, but given the proportion of immatures, an awful lot of the specimens are really tiny. 30 species, so it's quite a small species number after all that work, but 30 species. Each one fantastic and worth all the effort. Just as an idea across the data set, and again, these might be things we might try to have a look for today. I should just mention as well, I didn't do much snail searching yesterday. One of the key things you need is a tray. I should have brought a few of them. I just moved house last week. My trays are not to be found at the moment. I'm lucky I got myself here and my boots and other stuff. But yeah, we can have a look and see if we can find some of these common things. So the glossy pillar snail, Cotylocopa lubrica, was very common across the data set. One of the hairy snails, Trochilus hispidus, and the rayed glass snail, which is a really nice snail, has really nice, you can kind of make it out in that, but it's lovely shell architecture, these evenly spaced little lines etched into its shell. So you can see what we can see today. There are people with trays. I've seen people with trays. What we can do is we can shake out either leaf litter or we can take some clumps of grass and shake them out and just have a look and see what we see. In terms of rare or notable species that were found, so these are things that are listed on the red list. So like I mentioned, Leostyla anglica was not uncommon across the data set, found mainly in woodland, but not at all limited to woodland. I think it's considered an old woodland indicator in the UK, considered to require woodland cover for moisture, etc. I'll come back to that now in a second. It's not necessarily the case here. So we have the heath snail, Helicella itala. So again, in the photographs, in the bottom photograph, you can see an unstriped version, still the same species. So it's kind of this slaty blue-grey or brown, striped or not. But again, it's very big, so it's quite easy to tell. Acicula fusca, I'm sorry, I don't have a photo of this. It's absolutely beautiful. It's tiny. It's about just over a millimetre high and a fraction of a millimetre wide, orange with a beautiful line etched along the spirals. Absolutely beautiful, very, very common, but tiny. And I would imagine is missed in an awful lot of sampling, unless you're specifically looking for things this tiny. And one Vertigo pusilla, but a dead shell, as I said, so no confirmed live individual. Quite a tricky thing telling, like, they're all dead by the time I'm looking at them, unfortunately. But I'm looking for damage on the shell, worn shells. So you're making a judgment call. So you're kind of talking about long dead when you're saying it was dead. And look, it's still a useful judgment call to make, but you can't infer that there's a live population there still. So just also to mention Vertigo substriata and Coricium minimum, again, both fairly small species, typically understood to be found in wetter habitats than what I found them in, either marshes and fens or in moist woodlands. So there's a couple of things going on here. We have much fewer species of snail, just like many other things, compared to, for example, the UK. An awful lot of the literature, an awful lot of our ecological understanding comes from stuff that's written with a UK or even an England perspective, or maybe even continental Europe. Because we have fewer species, a lot of our species probably have wider niches. They may have evolved to do so, but there's also the distinct possibility that most of the west of Ireland is just damp enough that they don't need woodland to provide the moisture and the shelter. So look, I think it's a little bit of both. We have fewer species, so a lot of them have wider niches than what's typically understood, but also we just have more moisture. So. Okay, in terms of the grazing exclusion experiment, so this is just from the grassland sites, so the 4 grassland sites. So, and even this was just 3 years, so from the start to the end of the PhD. So we saw an increase in the number of snails at each of the grassland sites and an increase in the number of species. Well, sorry, there was one unusual site, which I'm not sure how to explain, but the general trend was fairly consistent. The snails liked the removal of grazing. So I'll elaborate on that in a second. But one of the big things, it's notoriously difficult to measure litter. You can see it, you can understand it, it's very distinct, but it's quite difficult to measure it consistently. Luckily, I was doing all the data recording, so at least the measuring was fairly consistent by me across the study. So the litter increased massively. You can see, particularly the photograph on the right-hand side, on the right of the photo, you can see the massive build-up of litter. That's now very, very few species of grass in there, and mainly just dense litter. And on the outside, you can see it's grazed short, and there's still massively diverse. That site actually has, between the two, the control and the study plot, that's in the Cahir Valley. I think it had 120 vascular plant species just within the fences. That's over 10% of the native flora of Ireland in two 20 by 20 metre plots in one field. So the level of diversity is amazing. It is not amazing now inside the fence. It is negligible. But it's amazing as well. A lot of the farmers were quite surprised at the amount of productivity in these grasslands, that so much litter built up so quickly. But the effects were pretty rapid inside the fences. So overall, and I'm going to touch on the vascular plant results as well as the snail results here, because they're obviously not unrelated. So very bad news for plant biodiversity. If you've no grazing in the grasslands, very quickly you're losing species. So some species were lost just in the first growing season and were never seen again inside the plots. So species like yellow rattle, species like Euphrasia, red Bartsia, they were gone immediately. They had been ubiquitous at low levels, low cover, but were just gone very quickly. And you just have a dominance of graminoids, mainly grasses, and a very small number of species. And even at that, now it's litter and very little live grass poking up through. Very mixed picture in the scrub, which is no surprise. It's so heterogeneous. In various of these study sites, some of them have had revisits from master's students looking at subsets of either at the mollusks or at the plants. Nobody has been back to any of the scrub sites. So a survey is long overdue. It will always be a mixed picture because they're so heterogeneous, but it is long overdue that we get some work and start pulling together the scrub picture. In the woodlands, in terms of the plants, so in the term of my PhD, 3 years is quite a short period of time in terms of the life of a woodland. There was an increase in diversity in the herb layer because animal trampling and mainly trampling in the woodlands, but trampling and grazing had been removed. But a master's student who went back, it was 12 years after the fence went up, found significantly lower plant diversity inside the fence plots in the woodland sites. So that's pretty much as you would expect. So now they're kind of choked up with brambles, but there is regeneration. If you were looking only at woody species, you would see better and more regeneration inside the plots. So just to give a bit of context, so in terms of the mollusks then, for the grasslands, like I mentioned, large increase in the volume of litter, increase in good mollusk habitat. They love it. Litter holds moisture. They like that. Many of them feed on dead plant material rather than live plant material. A lot of them feed on dead plant material, so they love that. So great increase in snails. So no grazing, kind of good news for snail biodiversity. And I put that in caveat, or the question mark and the exclamation mark, just because nothing is black and white. What this tells me is we need a mix. We need, as pretty much everybody has mentioned, we need diversity. We need to let areas grow tall. We need to let areas be abandoned. We need to not be too tidy. We don't want anything grazed short throughout. So, some elements of our biodiversity will benefit from different situations. And the effects in woodland and scrub may be more subtle. That's my way of saying it. We didn't get any strong trends with the snails yet. But there's only been one resurvey by a master's student in the woodlands, and God love her, I think she worked hard, but she really struggled to find snails. It can be difficult depending on the prevailing weather conditions and stuff. So very little has been done basically since then, and very little that we can use. So I think that's it. But before I finish, I just want to mention a couple of other things. How am I for time? Grant. Just to mention, because I know a lot of you will be particularly interested in our annex species, so the 3 vertigo species. So I just reminded myself where and what is found in the Burren in terms of those, and I thought that might be of interest. There's no vertigo gyri records from the Burren that I'm aware of, which is very surprising, because that species likes really strongly calcareous, mineral-rich flushes. Why is that not here? Have we just not looked? Have we not found it? That's a bit of a puzzle to me. There's one record of vertigo mullensiana from near Mullaghmore. Evelyn Morkins reconfirmed an older record that had been unlocalized. She reconfirmed it in 2006. I was slightly surprised at seeing that recently, but yeah, so that is definitely something we can keep a look at. It would be great to see what the habitat is like. I'm not sure what it was on. I don't know any further details about that. What kind of habitat it's on. Was it on cladium or what was it on? And are there other pockets we could look for it in? Vertigo angustior, your main plan is go to the beach. So there's lots of vertigo angustior at Fenor, Doonbeg, and on the Aran Islands. So the sand dune habitats now, there's management issues and there's things we get, that could be improved. But basically, yeah, there are populations, and some of them are doing very well on the coastal sand dunes. And separate to that, I wanted to mention, because we've had such a discussion about scrub, one of the things in my PhD, I did a lot of looking at scrub, and while I didn't get into it here, I was able to show through the plant work, and then also some master's students looked at lichen communities and bryophyte communities. There are distinct plant, bryophyte and lichen communities in the scrub habitats that are different and separate to the woodland communities and the grassland communities. The mollusk communities weren't distinct. It kind of overlapped if you were, with the other habitats. But for the plants, bryophytes and lichens, they were distinct communities, which is worth remembering the value of scrub. So we need to be continuously managing scrub, but continuously mindful of its value as well, and where we manage and how we manage. So I think that is enough for me now. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. We have time for one question in the room.
Actually, Helen,
Yeah.
I think we can take a few minutes now
Okay.
for questions to all the speakers,
Yeah.
but to Maria first,
Okay.
please.
Probably don't want to hear this, Maria. It's a question I don't know the answer to myself, but there you have a very large area of calcareous rock with virtually no rupestral or wall species in it. If you transferred that en bloc to Britain, to anywhere in Europe, you would have a long list of snails that live on the bare rock.
Well, interesting story. So the pollen and brone work, so I was working with archaeologists, team of archaeologists, so they gave me bags of samples, and I said, okay, I'll tell you about the snails. It's up to you to interpret them archaeologically, in terms of the layers you found them in and how likely they were to have been disturbed and all that. So I looked at the snails, and there was about 2,000 shells, and they were dominated. The dominant species was Pyramidula rupestris, which is a rocky species. There was a small handful of species, it was something like 20 or 30 out of the 2,000 that indicated woodland. And I learned a lot about how archaeologists look at information and how scientists look at information. I discounted the woodland information because the dominant story told me that there was open rock. Open rock was a feature. Whenever those snails landed in that area, open rock was the dominant habitat. They went, oh my God, look at the woodlands. There's a woodland species in there. It clearly was woodland. I guess archaeologists are used to finding tiny pieces of information and having to build a story from that. Whereas we had loads of information. We had 2,000 snail shells telling a story, and a couple of them were probably, aberrant. But anyway, so in that sample, I did find lots of Pyramidula rupestris, which is a species of rock and stone.
Yeah, it's also a species. The species that we have is confined to Western Europe, North Spain, West France, British Isles. It does live in rocks, but you don't see it on open rock formations. It's in small stones sitting particularly on top of stone dikes, stone walls. So it's slightly different. I think the climate suits it well in that respect, but you wouldn't call it a rock species as such. But it just amazes me that we don't have all these other genera that you get in Britain and Europe, in Ireland at all. It's really strange. Yeah,
we are definitely missing part of the xeric kind of community, the open, dry grassland or open rock. Yeah. And also don't know the answer. Yeah.
Any other questions for Maria? Sarah?
Great talk, Maria. And I do remember back in the day you having snail sorting parties to try
Oh, Darren, you were an undergrad at the time, possibly roped in.
I have a question that you probably don't have the answer to, but I think it's a theme that's emerging throughout this conference, which is quite interesting, is that, particularly for invertebrates, different groups do really have quite different requirements when it comes to habitat management, and you've shown this quite clearly for plants and molluscs. So just based on your findings here, what would be your key recommendations for grassland management to benefit both plants and molluscs?
It's a great question. It's something that I say everywhere I go. People, if I go out to visit a site, people are going, oh, you're not going to like this, Maria, because there'll be a patch of scrub in the corner of the grassland. And I'm saying, no, I love it. I have a very high tolerance for scrub in grasslands because it adds such diversity. So I think that's the key thing. Welcome the diversity, but never underestimate the subtlety of the management that's needed to keep an optimal diversity. You can be saying, oh, I love the scrub, and while you turn your back, the bracken is walking out from the scrub, or the scrub itself is walking out, or you suddenly have a small thicket of blackthorn that the cattle are suddenly moving around. So I think, welcome the diversity. We need to plan for diversity, but with that comes a bit of nuance in terms of the management. And you somehow want to avoid over-engineering that too. So, yeah. But, you know, what you do not want is to go in and say, graze this grassland down, or, you know, whatever, and remove the diversity. So, yeah, trying to find that balance. And it's a very difficult, we might all be saying, no, I know what you mean, but you might not. But trying to communicate that to landowners or land managers or to people who design farm plan schemes or agri-environment schemes, they're, well, look, which is it? It can be very, very difficult. And that's a challenge that's on us to communicate that degree, that we need that heterogeneity, that it's valued, yeah. But it's not a case of walking away and it'll all be fine.